Hey friends, this is Michael Bohm with Youth Apologetics Training. Today we're going to keep going with this series about Islam, and today we're talking about the Quran. We're going to be talking about the belief that the Quran comes from God, from Allah, and that it was written down in heaven on tablets or on a table of stone. And we're going to talk about whether or not that's possible. And we're going to be looking at whether or not the Quran shows any traits that God himself wrote it. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to talk about the Quran, and I don't want to get too deep in this, all right? In fact, I already ranted quite a bit towards the beginning of the series. But the Quran is the foundation stone, if you will, of their faith. It is their scriptures that they go by. It is claimed that it is, a perfect book. We talked about this earlier. Muhammad claims that he received this Quran from the angel Gabriel, who Gabriel apparently claimed that the Quran was written on a stone tablet the size of a table in heaven. Okay, so that's got to be either a huge tablet or very small writing. I don't know. But it is claimed that the Quran is perfect. There are no variant readings. Okay, so there's no different surahs or verses in surahs. There's no lost verses. There's no conflicting manuscripts. Nothing. There's no problems with the Quran. That's what it's claimed. It is claimed that the Quran in its Arabic is so perfect, so beautiful. In fact, I should mention, they use that as one of their proofs that the Quran is from heaven, is that it's so poetic and beautifully written. But anyway, they say that it is so perfect in Arabic that no man can translate it into another language. They say that there is nothing comparable to the Quran. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this is supposed to be just an introduction to Islam, but I just want to mention there are some major problems with the Quran. I mean, humongous problems. As we mentioned before, most of the Quran was written down on leaves, bones, just various things, whatever they could find. Some papyrus, bark from trees, whatever they could find is what they wrote down from Muhammad when he would have these seizures where he would fall to the ground, his eyes would roll back into his head, he would be gritting his teeth, he'd be sweating profusely, and he would basically receive these communications from whatever source, we don't know. But he would have these seizures, he would come forward once he was done, and he would dictate whatever he had heard, allegedly heard. And people would write stuff down. Okay, many Islamic scholars will admit that vast quantities or large quantities of these surahs or verses of surahs have been lost due to simply the fact that they wrote these down on biodegradable materials. They wrote on leaves and bark and bones, and they lost a lot of the writings. That is admitted by Muslim scholars nowadays. Okay, it's also admitted that many of the surahs were memorized. Okay, they were memorized by men, and then somehow they had to dictate those surahs back to somebody who could write them down later when they got to some writing material. Some of those men, again, this is just plain fact. This is part of Islamic history. Okay, Muslim scholars will admit this. They have admitted this in writings. Several of the surahs that were memorized, the men who memorized them died before the surahs got written down. That's just a fact. Okay, as far as the Quran being perfect in Arabic, Islamic scholar Ali Dashti, oh boy, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, in his writing, or his book 23 Years, he talks about the Quran, and this is what he says. He says, the Quran contains sentences which are incomplete and not fully intelligible without the aid of commentaries. There's foreign words, unfamiliar Arabic words, and words used with other than the normal meaning. Adjectives and verbs inflected without observance of the concords of gender and number, illogically and ungrammatically applied pronouns, which sometimes have no referent, and predicates, which in rhymed passages are often remote from the subjects. And then in a separate writing, to sum up, Ali Dashti also writes, to sum up, more than 100 Quranic aberrations from the normal rules and structure of Arabic have been noted. All right, so we've got all kinds of grammatical errors. It's not perfect Arabic. And I guess on that same note, they claim that it is written in perfect Arabic. There's a book out there, The Foreign Vocabulary of the Quran by Arthur Jeffrey, and he says that the Quran contains over 100 foreign, non-Arabic words, like Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, Akkadian, Ethiopian, and Persian words and phrases are found in the Quran. All right, and Muslims also often will attack the Bible because they say that it has many variant readings. Okay, there's different manuscripts, and by the way, there are. Okay, that's a simple fact of the matter. There are different manuscripts from antiquity that have variant readings of the text. Now, I will do a series on this. Although I'm not an expert, I have studied this pretty decently. And yes, there are, but we can reconstruct the entire Bible. We know for a fact what it says. And there are just the tiniest shred of variants that are in question. And it all comes down to the spelling of names of people and places. That's what it really usually comes down to. Oh boy, I don't want to get too far into this. There are a couple New Testaments, such as the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, that are often used for in writing the newer versions of the Bibles. Okay, those two texts are ridiculously corrupt, and then they were further brought forward and used by a couple guys, Westcott and Hort, who were occultists, who openly claimed to be occultists. They had their own group called the Ghostly Guild, where they communicated with dead spirits. They ran with some very interesting occultic friends. That's a whole nother series, by golly. My point, good grief, I got all sidetracked. Yes, the Bible does have some manuscripts that are corrupt. All right? Variant readings. But the Quran, Muslims say that they don't have these manuscripts. All right? I'm just simply refuting that idea. They do. They do. For example, back to this Arthur Jeffrey. He's got a book, Material for the History of the Text of the Quran, and he says, and this is straight from the Islamic Invasion book, by the way, by Robert Morey, a great book. Really, I suggest you guys buy it. He says, at one point, Jeffrey gives 90 pages of variant readings on the text. For example, in Surah 2, there are over 140 conflicting and variant readings on the text of the Quran. All Western and Muslim scholars admit the presence of variant readings in the Quran. I'm going to screw this name up, but Gulemi points out that the Quran at first had a large number of variants, not always trifling in significance. In other words, some of them were, kind of trivial, small. Others were pretty big variants. It is interesting to note that in scholarly Muslim journals, there's beginning to be a grudging acknowledgement of the fact that there are variant and conflicting readings on the text of the Quran. All right, and again, I'm not saying this because, I'm not saying this in a hypocritical way. I admit that the Bible has variant readings in some of its manuscripts, most of which, by the way, are just simply names of people and names of places. But we do have some. That's a different study. I'm just simply pointing out that they claimed for the longest time that there were no variant readings when in fact there absolutely was. Another thing that is interesting to note is this whole thing about Uthman. Okay, this is that guy, if you guys remember, that one of Muhammad's daughters married. And this guy collated. He pulled the Quran together. He was the guy that really did a lot of the work of getting the Quran put together. But the Quran was already assembled by his time. He just wanted to make sure that as many of the variant versions of the Quran were destroyed. I hate to say it, but there were many surahs that he did not agree with politically. Okay, these are words supposedly written down in heaven. All right, that's what I'm trying to get at here. It'd be one thing if he was just doing some quality control, as in somebody wrote some surahs that were not from Muhammad, therefore not from God. No, these were actually Muhammad-written surahs that he went around and collected and burned them. All right? He destroyed some of the surahs that supposedly came from God from this tablet, this table. That's interesting, to say the least. All right, if this was from God, if this was from Allah, and Gabriel dictated it to Muhammad, why did this guy come along and destroy these? And the Muslims don't seem to have a problem with it. That's interesting. There are missing verses in the Quran. All right, so like I was saying, there's missing verses, all kinds of missing verses in surahs. One surah, for example, had 200 verses taken out in the days of Aisha. That was the wife that Muhammad married when she was 6, consummated their marriage when she was 9. Another surah, Uthman, took out 127 verses. That's huge, guys. In fact, Shiite Muslims claim that Uthman left out 25% of the original verses in the Quran for political reasons. We have another guy named Abdullah Sar. I'm probably messing his name up. He was a friend of Muhammad at one point, and he would make suggestions to Muhammad about rephrasing, adding to, or subtracting from the surahs. And Muhammad did, oftentimes, what Abdullah had suggested to him. Now again, guys, if these verses actually came from Allah, would there really be anything that needed to be rephrased? Would there be any verses that need to be deleted? Would there be any surahs that need to be deleted? Would there be grammatical errors in them? Would Allah allow for verses to go missing at all? Would he allow for any of his Quran to go missing? We have the problem of abrogated verses. Abrogation is the whole idea that Allah will sometimes overrule previous revelations by a new one. I guess it would be very, very, very loosely similar to the Christian concept of dispensationalism. And like I said, very loosely. Okay, but they have this idea of some revelations get covered up by later ones. For example, the satanic verses, I mentioned those earlier. This whole thing where at one point, maybe I didn't mention this earlier, I did mention that in Mecca, those who worshipped the moon god by various names, one of which was Allah, the Quraysh tribe called him Allah, which is the tribe that Muhammad comes from. But they worshipped Allah, and that Allah, the moon god, had 3 daughters with the sun goddess. Okay? These 3 daughters were Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. These 3 daughters were worshipped as intercessors. They were gods, or, they were the daughters of gods. And they were worshipped in Mecca. And Muhammad, at one point, cowed down and wrote in the Quran, in some verses, some surah verses, that it's okay to worship Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And then later came along and said, no, that's not true. Satan himself influenced me to write those verses, and had them taken back out. Guys, does that ever happen in the Bible? Was there ever a prophet that goofed up? And hey, by the way, all you who subscribe to these different prophets, these apostles, who bust out all these prophecies, God told me this, God told me that, and it turns out 95% of what they say is proven wrong in years to come. Prophets never goof. All right? When God is speaking through them, they never make mistakes. Ever, 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 ever. And so going back to Muhammad, who wrote these satanic verses, prophets never make mistakes. They don't write false information and then attribute it to God. It doesn't happen. Let's stop right there. Tomorrow we'll keep going. We're going to keep talking about the Quran and whether or not it shows any evidence at all that it was written by God himself. And so anyway, come out to the website, youthapologeticstraining.com, and there, guys, you can leave comments and questions. I do want to talk to you guys. You can also catch me on Google+, Facebook, and Twitter. And with that, I love you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.